So yeah, thank you for joining this evening. Tonight we're going to be talking about understanding pet bereavement through the human-animal bond. My background is in veterinary nursing, so I've been a qualified veterinary nurse for a really long time, and more recently qualified as a therapist, so a psychotherapeutic counsellor a few years ago, and I've been working at the Ralph in that role for a few years. So let's get on with it. So this evening, we're going to be talking about, as I said, the human-animal bond, so a little bit about what that is and why that's important. And then we're going to look into grief and end-of-life care. We're going to talk about how it's best to communicate with people who are grieving and develop ways to improve our own ability to support grieving people. I'd really like to just make a note that this webinar is available to veterinary professionals, but also pet carers too. And so I have tried to incorporate different points for different groups of people, but please do take what you need from this evening's webinar and leave the rest. But there are going to be some things maybe that are geared slightly more veterinary and some things that are not. So before we get started, it is quite a heavy topic, and I think it's really important that we just do a quick self-check-in. So if we can just take a minute to either close your eyes or have a soft gaze to the floor and put your hands either on your lap or one hand on your chest and one hand on your stomach, or maybe even a butterfly hug, so just kind of crossing your arms like this. And as you're doing that, if you just take a moment to focus in on your breath. So breathing in and breathing out. And as you're doing that, just take a moment to notice what it feels like as you draw that air in, what it feels like to let that breath go. And just quickly do a very quick self kind of body scan. So starting at the top of your head, all the way down, kind of a mental checklist. How is your body feeling? Checking down both sides, all the way down to your toes. And as you're doing that, just asking yourself if there are any kind of aches or pains or niggles. Are you feeling comfortable in the seat that you're in? If not, maybe have a little wiggle about to get more comfortable. And then focusing back on your breath. We don't need to change anything else about how we are, but just noticing how you're doing before we start this webinar. And once you're ready, if you can open your eyes and we will start. There we are. Okay, we're going to start with looking at the human-animal bond. So what is the human-animal bond? Well, we know that as pet lovers and as animal lovers, our animals are sort of intricately woven into how we live our day-to-day lives. And that has been the same for centuries. We have a mutual trust between us and animals. Animals seem to gravitate towards people, and we seem to gravitate towards them on the whole. There seems to be a mutual understanding a lot of the time between us, and I think that they can teach us so much. So our pets are enormous parts of the family and are often just as, if not sometimes more important than our human family members to a lot of us. And because of this kind of natural gravitation that we have towards each other, over time, it's only natural that actually we have been able to utilize animals and this human-animal bond to really benefit people and vice versa. So we take care of them and sometimes they take care of us. And that can be through kind of countless different ways. And one of the ways is animal-assisted intervention. And so we might have animals that are maybe effectively employed in some way in different roles. And so we know that horses, for example, are really important in lots of equine therapy. People really benefit from spending time talking to horses, grooming horses, and playing music with horses. We know that dogs are probably the most utilised and most kind of domesticated animal in the world, and that they help us with domestic chores around the house. So we have dogs trained into helping people answer the door if they can't hear the door. We obviously have our guide dogs, medical assistance dogs. We have search and rescue dogs, like up mountains in water. We have dogs helping farmers and getting involved in farming culture to protect livestock. And we have dogs going into schools and teaching children to read, especially children that maybe are finding it much more challenging to start to do that. And it isn't just dogs and horses. We do have cats that are providing a lot of therapeutic help in different spaces. And we can also see guinea pigs, rabbits, and other animals, sometimes birds, in different therapeutic spaces too. And so they really are kind of intertwined with how we live our day-to-day lives, even outside of pet companionship, which I'm sure that a lot of us are. So according to the Human Animal Bond Research Institute, HABRI, the human animal bond is defined as a mutually beneficial and dynamic relationship between people and animals that is influenced by behaviours that are essential to the health and well-being of both. We know from research over many years that animals help us kind of exponentially with many different things. And I've just listed a few here. So our cardiovascular health is really improved by being around animals. We can find support with disabilities, workplace benefits, social isolation and loneliness. Often our pets are the best silent listeners, and really kind of accepting of us in whatever form we have. And I'm sure as you're sat there this evening, you can think of a million different ways in which your pets, both past and present, have helped you for many different things. So it's in our DNA, and this is just a little bit of information that I find really interesting. I've only kind of learned about telomeres in the last few years, and I'm sure that they are only kind of one reason why animals have this enormous benefit on us, but I thought that they are a really cool thing to kind of know about and talk about. So telomeres are protective structures located at the ends of our chromosomes. They're almost like little shoes or little caps, and these protect the ends of our chromosomes from damage. And so they're involved in cell aging and division. Telomere shortening is a natural process, but it can lead to cellular death when telomeres become too short. And so here is just a picture of an X chromosome here. And at the end, these little pink caps are our telomeres. And as we age, these telomeres naturally shorten, and we can't stop that. That just happens. It's a normal part of aging. But some studies have shown that there is a direct correlation between increased cortisol, which is one of our main stress hormones, and premature telomere shortening. So basically, in people who maybe are experiencing a high volume of stress, we might see a shorter telomere length than in people experiencing less stress, for example. And so in younger populations, we might have really robust, long, healthy telomeres like this. And as we age, we will expect them to shorten over time. But essentially, reducing stress and then therefore reducing our cortisol levels can lead to better health. And that can be physical, mental, and also just our aging overall. So how do our animals help our health? We know that they lower our cortisol levels, and so that's why that's in our DNA. In turn, that really improves our sleep quality, unless maybe you're sharing the bed with them, in which case maybe they don't, but that's individual. They also help lower our blood pressure, our heart rate, and our respiratory rate. We see increased levels of oxytocin, which is our love hormone when we interact with our loved pets. We can therefore have an improved mood, and in people struggling with mental health disorders, have sort of a decrease in their depressive symptoms. We see an improvement in physical health when we are in pet companionship. So obviously when you're out walking your dog, you're getting much more physical exertion than you are if you don't. People who are out with livestock or farming animals, they will also have an improved physical health, and people who engage with horses as well will have increased physical health. They help us with our social interaction. I'm sure that many of you who have dogs or who have had dogs will know that when you're on your local dog walks, people will say hi to each other. Often you probably know the dog's name and not the human's name. And so they really promote social interaction where otherwise maybe there isn't very much for us. And in that way, and in others, it really helps slow cognitive decline. So elderly people who have pets in the home often will be in the home a little bit longer than their counterparts without pets, because they are continuing to provide care and they're continuing to have social engagement with another creature in their day-to-day, even if otherwise they're quite lonely. So throughout history, the domestication of animals and use of animals has led to increased survival of lots of species, and animals are often shown to gravitate to humans for companionship, safety, or food provisions. It's really important that we ensure all animals, both participating in AAI, so the assisted interventions, but also not, should have regular veterinary assessments for their physical and mental health to ensure they're really happy to continue and be retired from those roles when they're not. And so we see this, for example, in guide dogs who maybe get to a certain age and actually they therefore would benefit from retiring so that they can live a comfortable life without kind of this work stress as well. Everyone has the right to good medical care, food, and a comfortable life and death where possible. So HABRI, which is this Human Animal Bond Research Institute, have a really marvellous website with lots and lots of research on the human animal bond. And so there's just a couple of bits really that I wanted to pick out that I thought were really interesting. This survey that they did of 2,000 pet carers found that when people were educated about the health benefits of caring for their pets, the majority said they were more likely to maintain a pet's health. And as you can see, that included keeping up with vaccines and preventative medicine. It also meant that they were really much more regular checkups with their vet. They're also much more likely to provide a pet with good nutrition, health insurance, and just generally take better care of their pet. So that's just with a little bit of education about the benefits. And the other kind of snippet of research I wanted to pluck out was about pet-friendly workplaces. So over kind of the last few years, I think definitely since COVID, we've seen kind of an increase in pet-friendly workplaces, probably because lots of people aren't going into the office, and so maybe offices having more space, but some places are increasing their provision for you to bring your dog to work at least. And actually, they have done some research that have shown that pets in the workplace were more likely to be perceived to reduce stress, facilitate social interactions, as we talked about before, and to serve as a symbol for the organisation, but also as a self-expressive function for the individuals. Pets at work were shown to reduce stress for the people doing their jobs and make the environment more comfortable, provide a pleasant diversion from work and probably some entertainment, and that even customers to different workplaces were more relaxed and interactive because they kind of had a distraction and something to talk about with people. We can see here from this research that the majority of people who worked for a pet-friendly company felt more engaged with their work. They felt that they were doing much more rewarding work and exciting work than the people who weren't working in pet-friendly places, but also that they had a more positive working relationship with their supervisors and also their co-workers as well. So actually having pets in the workplace seemed to have many more benefits than kind of negatives. Okay, so now we've kind of looked at the human-animal bond, we're going to be moving on to the grief section. We're going to be talking about pet loss and death, so please, if you do struggle, please switch off this evening and reach out to somebody for support. You are welcome to watch this back at a later date. As Tony said, it's going to be uploaded to our website. If you do have children, I would really encourage you to watch this without them to make your own assessment of whether this is going to be a suitable thing for them to watch or not based on their age and their development. It's really impossible to be able to put a number on kind of how old this webinar is aimed for because, you know, children are so different, experiences are so different. And so I think it's really important that as a parent, you would make that judgment yourself after watching it. Okay, so when we think about pet loss, often we think about pet death. And pet loss can happen through a myriad of different experiences. What I think most of us as pet carers hope for is that we will have a planned euthanasia for our pet at the end of their natural life cycle. And with that often is slightly kind of a more ease in our grief in that we have maybe had our pets for an expected length of time and that we've been able to plan out and really kind of be there for all the different parts of that euthanasia. Sometimes, though, that isn't possible, and sometimes we have an unexpected euthanasia and we might lose a pet suddenly. And this can happen through illness, but it can also happen through accident. And as we think about that, I'm sure that you can imagine there would be many different emotions that would come up with all of these different things. Accidents bring up a lot of guilt, even if that was absolutely nothing to do with how you were doing something, because we feel so responsible for our loved pets. We also lose animals through rehoming. Often that is through no choice at all. So a common thing that we see in practice will be pet carers who have had to make the decision to rehome through maybe relocation, especially in kind of our renters market. Lots of people are kind of forced to make that decision. We also know that people experiencing homelessness will often be forced to rehome if they are not going into pet-friendly accommodation. But we can also see people having to rehome pets through choice. And that can be a really difficult one too, because again, similarly to accidents, it kind of comes with this self-doubt or self sort of guilt for being part of that. Many of us that have pets will know that once we enter that kind of companionship, we never plan to lose a pet through rehoming. But again, it might be in the best interest of us, it might be in the best interest of our pet, and it's something that I think we really need to hold no judgment for. Another kind of pet loss that we might experience that maybe not all of us think about is the working animal retirement. So those pets that we spoke about in animal assisted interventions, once they get to a certain age and they retire, or if they become ill and they are having to retire early, often that means pet loss for that family too. Sometimes people will be able to keep their retired guide dogs, for example, but in many homes, especially if they continue to need an animal working for them, then they will have a guide dog come in to take that guide dog's place. And often a family might not be able to keep, for whatever reason, that older guide dog. And so they will go into a rehoming situation. And so they will experience that pet loss again through no kind of choice of their own. And it's still a really, really difficult thing to be dealing with. I'm sure that there are many other ways of experiencing pet loss, and they're all as valid as each other, but just a few really to give us an idea of how different we might all feel in all of these different situations. So then thinking about grief, there are many different types of grief, and we're going to talk about grief and what that is. Um, there are the few kind of parts about grief that I wanted to kind of touch on in more detail were these on the screen. So firstly, anticipatory grief. In veterinary medicine, we see anticipatory grief all the time in pet carers. And anticipatory grief is essentially the process of starting to grieve for our pets even before they have gone. Often this is started maybe when our pet is first taken ill with something. Maybe this starts to happen as we notice subtle aging changes in our pets. So maybe we start to kind of realize that they're aging and start to really dread losing them, even if they're very, very well. And anticipatory grief can be really, really painful to deal with, and it can be quite confusing to deal with if you can't put a name to it. So hopefully knowing that that is a real thing and knowing that it is still a very valid form of grief can just help normalize some of those feelings that you might have in anticipation of pets getting older or pets getting sick and having to go into the vets, because it's just such a challenge to deal with, but also to then have to make decisions about your pets whilst you're going through these very, very tough emotions is hard. We also see secondary loss in grief. And so that is the secondary loss that comes from losing our pet. For example, in pets who are maybe very, very elderly, if we have formed a routine around them and we are giving them many medications several times a day, and maybe we are sleeping differently, or we have changed our life in some way to facilitate their care, when we lose that pet, we also lose our routine, we lose our structure. We might, if we only have our one dog, we might lose the walks that we do every day. And that maybe means that we lose the interactions socially with the people we meet out and about. And that loss can also feel really, really difficult. We might also see that secondary loss with our assistant animals. So maybe we lose a dog who is there to help us with our hearing, and suddenly you have lost your dog, which is difficult enough to deal with, but you've also lost your ears. And so you're also trying to navigate life with this huge change and also this enormous grief. Another type of grief that we see a lot in ourselves around veterinary clients is complex grief. And this can come up for, again, a variety of different reasons in people, but often it's when you have lots of compounded grief. So maybe you have had lots of trauma in your past and it's been one after the other. Maybe you have had several losses within the last year, but just as you kind of start to maybe have some grief for one person or one animal, somebody else is gone, and so that process just never really gets anywhere, and that can be a really, really difficult thing, often needing support in the form of bereavement counselling or speaking to a doctor. And the other type of grief that I want to talk about this evening is disenfranchised grief. And this is something that people experience in many forms of life. But in the veterinary world, we see this because the loss, especially kind of in our culture in the UK, the loss of a pet is not often seen as this enormous loss that it is. And so sometimes when I'm speaking with carers who are grieving, often I'll hear, maybe they've lied to their workplace about why they're off work. Maybe they've said that they're sick. Something else is happening in the family, because they know that if they said the real reason that they've lost their pet, that they're going to get sort of an answer that really belittles how they're feeling. Some people will hear, oh, they were just a dog or just a cat, and that can be really, really painful. It comes often, I think, from people who have never experienced that bond with an animal, but it really is such a misunderstanding about what our companions are to us. We might also feel that we can't feel this grief for a pet if they weren't ours. Maybe we are a dog walker and we walk these dogs, 3 times a week, every week for their whole lives, and then that pet passes away, and we feel this enormous grief and this enormous hole in our life, but they're not our pet. So can we grieve about them? Do we feel guilty about that? That is kind of what is disenfranchised grief. It's a grief that we don't feel allowed to have. And as I said, there are many more types of grief, and probably many more than 12, but those are kind of what we've only got time for this evening, and kind of the most applicable to us as carers and as veterinary professionals. So am I grieving correctly? This is something that a lot of people are wondering. Lots of people don't think they're normal for the way that they're grieving, or they've been told that they should be feeling a certain way at a certain time frame, or kind of even just being given the perception that they should be over it, or kind of moving on. So in order to address that, I just want to have a look very quickly at a few different grief models. And the first is Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Now, there are many different types of grief models if you wanted to go and have a look at them. But yeah, I've just picked a couple. And the reason I've picked Kubler-Ross is the stages of grief is because this is the one that people tend to see or know about first off. And it's the one that I think often causes the most distress, because it almost sets out that you need to go through these 5 stages, these ones here. And you imagine that that's within an order, so that first is denial, then is anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And it can be really quite challenging when you're a grieving person to be told that there are stages, because maybe you were feeling a certain way, maybe you were feeling very depressed, or maybe you were starting to accept the death of your pet, but then one day you're suddenly back to anger, or you're suddenly feeling guilty, and that can then feel like maybe you've gone backwards. But actually, this kind of model of grief was developed for people who have just recently had a terminal diagnosis themselves, and is not intended to be used for grief as a coverall. And so it kind of got expanded to these 7 stages of grief. But it's just not a model that I like, because I think it really kind of perpetuates a normal way to be, and there is not one normal way to be in grieving. So the next model that I do quite like is the Strebe and Shute dual process model. And so on the left here, we've got our loss-oriented tasks, and on the right-hand side here, we've got our restoration-oriented tasks, and in the middle, it's us. So on the left, this is kind of our severe grief. So our grief work. Over here, we might think about, you know, really hysterically crying. Maybe we think about wishing life was different or as before. Maybe we feel really, really depressed. We feel we can only think about our loved one, and really struggle to kind of think of anything else. This is a very negative kind of state often. And on our restoration side, this is how we are figuring out life now without our pets. This is how we are creating new experiences for ourselves, maybe forming new friendships, new hobbies, and also establishing different family dynamics if we've lost our pets in the family. And in the middle, we kind of see this oscillating kind of mark, which shows that actually at the beginning, we spend a lot of our time over here. This is kind of where we are mostly. And over time, we kind of flip back and forth. And hopefully the idea is that in any kind of grieving, as time goes on, and again, there's no timeline for this, but we find ourselves shifting more into the restoration oriented side of things. But that doesn't mean that once we're over here, we could be over here for years, and we could be over here for maybe 95% of the time, but it still doesn't mean that we don't ever jump back and that we don't ever feel like really devastated. It just kind of normalizes that we flit between the two and that that's okay. And the last model that I wanted to talk about is Worden's 4 tasks of mourning. And this is a very, very simple kind of grief model. The first being that we accept the reality of the loss. And so for many of us, that will be very different depending on what this loss has been. The loss of a very elderly pet in a way that we maybe have planned a euthanasia and we have been through all of those processes will feel much more easy to accept than the reality of a loss of a very, very young pet, of a pet who has been in an accident or has had maybe a cancer diagnosis super early, and it feels really unfair. Those losses maybe take a bit longer for us to get around to accepting them. We then will start to like process that pain of grief, and that can look different for everybody as we adjust to a different world without them. And I think the reason I like this one is because it does incorporate finding that enduring connection with your pet or whoever you have lost in your new life. So it's important that when we consider all of the following, we will react really differently as people. And so we express all of our emotions really differently. And it can be for a variety of reasons. We've all got our own backgrounds that we bring into it. We've all got our own history. And the way that we grieve will really depend on everything. So looking at what our companions meant to us, what did they represent in our life? Looking at the wider story around them, how did we get them? How did they come into our life? You know, who was around at that time? Often our pets maybe are linked to other family members who are maybe no longer with us either. We can think about our family tree, neurodiversity, because that will often present other issues within the household. You know, maybe our pets really were everything to somebody dealing with autism, for example, in the home. And then how does that feel in the grief? That can really change things. We can also really differ in how we deal with grief because of our past experiences of loss, whether we've had a planned euthanasia, whether we've lost a pet suddenly. All of these things can feed into how we start to deal with the grief of this pet. Also, our personal beliefs around euthanasia and death might be very different, and that's something that we really need to talk to each other about. So talking to your family about to work out kind of where you are on that, talking with your veterinary team as well about where you are. And as vets, it's really important to ask around these things really sensitively so that we can form a good picture around the bond that we have with our carers, to really help be there for them in as many ways as we can. And also considering the family dynamics of that pet within the family tree. So who was the pet to each family member? Often you'll see a family and they will have all different relationships with the same pet in the home. Sometimes that pet might be the glue that has held people together. And so once we consider the loss of that pet, maybe it's a really tricky relationship, and it's really hard to know what to talk about or what to do with each other now that that pet is gone. What about other pets in the home? Sometimes in multi-pet households, pets will have their silent or maybe not so silent dynamics between themselves. Maybe one of them is a bit more in charge, maybe one of them is a bit more shy. And how might that all change now that we're looking at a life without that pet in the picture? Okay, so now we're going to look at end-of-life care. And this section will touch on some of the practical aspects of end-of-life care from a veterinary perspective. If you're a pet carer watching, it's just really important to know that whilst these considerations are very necessary for us to be able to provide you the best service we can, they don't reflect the emotional kind of aspect of care and compassion that your veterinary team will feel during such a difficult time. So as a veterinary professional, it's really important that we have as much transparency around end-of-life care in your practice as possible. When you think about the protocols in your practice, consider, are you happy with them as an individual? Are they protocols that you would be happy with choosing for your loved pet? And if not, maybe considering what could be changed. Often in practices, in veterinary practices, as a vet or a nurse or a receptionist or anyone involved, it might mean that you don't have direct control over changing things, but if there are things that you think could be improved within the practice, then it's really important to raise them, because end-of-life care, I think, can sometimes be a forgotten aspect of our patient care. Maybe consider having champions of end-of-life care in your practice. So that would be somebody, maybe a veterinary nurse or a patient care assistant, who really kind of loves being able to provide the service to the best way they can for carers. And having a champion in the practice of being able to do that can mean that actually they keep up to date on CPD, they keep up to date on any kind of new things that come out, and kind of be able to kind of benefit both the veterinary practice, but also our pet carers and our patients in end-of-life care. It's important that both the carer and the veterinary team are involved in the process and the decision making wherever possible. And of course, it's always really important that our carers have informed consent when it comes to end-of-life care. I know that everybody tries to have the staff continuity where it's available for long-term patients especially, and trying not to make assumptions. And I guess that comes into informed consent too, because maybe for us, we would assume that maybe we want a paw print from our pet, etc., at the end of their life. But actually not everybody does, and that's okay. So just making sure that anything that is planned is really something that is discussed with the carer at every step. As a carer, you're absolutely welcome to ask about our practice's end-of-life resources and protocols, because it's a really important part of our patient care for you. Both carer and veterinary nurses getting involved in the process, as I said, you are welcome to informed consent. You have to have informed consent. And so asking any questions that you have at any point, it doesn't have to be at the end of life point, it can be before that. And as a family, just kind of really carefully considering whether children should be present for end of life. And again, as I said at the beginning of this kind of section for the webinar, it will really depend on individuals' children's development and emotional regulation to be able to know whether that is something that they should be there for. And I think only parents can really make that decision on behalf of their children. But if you do decide to bring children in for a euthanasia, for example, making sure that there is kind of a backup plan if actually they don't seem to cope, or you want to spend time with your pet, but maybe your child maybe doesn't want to be in there. And so for planned euthanasia, lots of people will now have a special room within practices if they have, a large enough practice to do that. If it's a really nice day, you're welcome to ask to go outside or have a special bed, toys, food, and even our pets' other companions if that's appropriate. It's really important to have the options to discuss aftercare wishes prior to euthanasia. And obviously we're talking about planned euthanasias here where maybe we do have more time, but so that carers can be able to give informed consent and choose the care that they want for their companion, including cremation decisions, burial decisions, and maybe having information leaflets in reception or given out kind of as and when to explain the process is really helpful to people prior to euthanasia. And then when it comes for payment, some carers maybe would want to pay before so they don't have to think about that around the time, but others might not want this. And so maybe just questioning as a veterinary professional what your practice protocols are about collecting any kind of debt in the practice. As a carer, it's really important to just hold that veterinary care is private healthcare in the UK. And so costs are usually involved even during end-of-life decisions. And I understand that can be especially tough. But please don't think that this means your vets care any less. They really truly understand how difficult this time is for you and are most likely pet carers themselves. And so there's no wrong way to be in your grief. Some people will want to spend time with their pet during and following their death, and some people don't or can't. And there are countless reasons why that might be. And so it's really important that we withhold any judgment for that. Most practices would really want to provide carers the time to spend with your pet for as long as you want, but many don't have the facilities. It sometimes does just come down to space. So if you are planning for this and you are imagining that that will be really important to you when the time comes, it's okay to start asking questions at any point. As a veterinary professional, maybe considering if there are any extra touches you could add to make this time more comfortable for carers, maybe providing check-in phone calls a couple of days later, especially if you know that people are on their own or have kind of a little family. And I think answering any unanswered medical questions that might come up for carers can be really, really helpful. We know that in grief, we are often presented with endless whys and what ifs, and the more that we can help as vets settle some of these, the better that our carers might cope. However, as a carer, if your vet has answered lots of medical questions as much as they can, sometimes you still might be left feeling like you want more answers. And it's a really, really normal part of grief, but you may benefit from some bereavement counselling. Our vets are experts at what they do, but they're not therapists. And so, whilst vets will have lots of different difficult conversations with carers and will often be quite comfortable supporting you through the loss of a pet, they just might not have the time or the training to be able to support you in the way that you require or deserve. If you are watching this as a veterinary professional with an interest in doing this, then there are now many courses available as CPD to provide you the basics of how to have difficult end-of-life conversations with carers. They don't equip you to be a therapist, but they are really, really invaluable in learning communication skills to just feel more comfortable to be the person that maybe can do the check-in phone calls, for example. And we'll kind of link to some resources at the end as well for where to find support. So now thinking about honouring our pet's memory, some people don't know where to begin when it comes to this, but it's important to know that actually having some form of memorial is how we can start to form a new and different bond with our loved pet after they have gone. It's really normal in a lot of places to have memorials or even funerals for animal companions and to celebrate their life as we often do for people. But I think, and I can only really speak for us in the UK, it hasn't been as a normal, a kind of normalized thing yet. So I'm trying to make sure that it is. And I think that by doing so, more and more places are starting to offer different services. If you're interested in having a funeral service for your pet, then some places do offer this. They will offer an attended cremation. Some places will provide a burial service. They are rare, but you can find them if you do some searching online. Dignity, who are the pet crematorium that we use here at the Ralph, do have a memorial garden for pets. And if you wanted your ashes of your pets to be spread there, they do have that service and they have attended cremations. But there are many other places, and many vets will have their own cremations or burial services. So just having a look and researching to be able to find what might suit you when that time comes. And some memorial suggestions, and again, this isn't exhaustive. Often people will choose to have a garden service with the ashes if they have an individual cremation of their pet. And some people will choose to have a garden burial, but it's important if you do go down that route that you find out your legal kind of barriers, if you like, depending on which council and where you are in the country. Some people will choose to have a family gathering to share memories of their loved pet. You might want to write them a poem, draw them a picture of their favourite place or their companions. And I think getting children involved in the more creative sides of memorials is also really, really helpful. I've seen people doing group walks around the dog's favourite places, inviting their friends and families, dog walkers, anyone who knew them. And that can be a really lovely way to kind of finalise their journey and sort of say goodbye to them in all their favourite places. Another idea that I really like in terms of enduring that bond and continuing that bond into the future is carrying their memory into action. So maybe that's volunteering at an animal shelter, donating, raising funds in their memory, maybe running the London Marathon, or something similar. Or maybe even having a shrine to visit. So that could be indoors, outdoors, somewhere that you've got some favourite photos, maybe a poem that you've written or that you have found that really resonates. And just continuing to have a dialogue with them. So speaking to them or about them on their gotcha days, their birthdays, or any special days that you maybe would have shared with them before. Transitional objects are things that help us move from one thing to another. And often we see this in children. So we will have children who have maybe a favourite toy or a blanket that helps them go and sleep at their grandparents' house or sleep at a friend's house. And actually, as adults, we can also have transitional objects to ease us into different life stages. When it comes to losing our pets, many people will keep a pet's collar or favourite toy. We might also maybe want paw prints or nose prints, or maybe a clipping of our pet's fur. Whatever it is okay. And some people might take some encouraging to think about something that might comfort them in their pet's death. Okay, so we are coming towards the end, but top tips for improving the way that you are with grief and loss, both for you and in supporting other people. So when it comes to communicating in grief, it can be really tempting when somebody is very, very upset in front of us to kind of give them the silver lining. And actually, when you're grieving, and I'm sure for probably all of us in that place, that can just be really unhelpful. It's not what we need to hear. There are no silver linings when we've lost our best friend. Actually, what we need is just empathy. And so there are really kind of quick communication tools that, with some practice, can be really helpful in just continuing these conversations. So active listening. And in active listening, that is listening to what that person has to say, not trying to decide what we're going to respond to them. Mirroring, paraphrasing, and reflecting can just be really simple ways of showing your empathy, showing your understanding without inserting your own stuff into the conversation. So often, if somebody is saying how much they miss their pet or how sad they are about losing their pet, you might hear somebody say, "Oh, yes, do you know, when I lost my pet, I felt like that, or I felt like this." And whilst that might be helpful to some people, often that can just kind of be taking away or stunting what they're trying to communicate to you. And actually, it would be much better to say, "Oh, I can really hear how Fluffy was, really important to you in shaping your life," or "Oh, I can really understand that actually now that he's gone, your life is looking so different." Really just making sure that you're validating what that person is experiencing and not taking away from them or trying to compare. So essentially, the biggest takeaway from communication in grief is don't listen to respond, listen to hear. So doing regular self-check-ins is really important when we're grieving. So what is your capacity? Doing a debrief with yourself after difficult consultations with carers, colleagues, or even just our family members and friends. If you are grieving, maybe journaling your felt bodily senses each day. How are your stress levels? Do you feel upset by anything that happened today? How does your body feel? Doing body scans, like we did at the beginning of this evening's webinar, are really helpful here to kind of notice any changes, any subtle changes in our body, because our bodies are often trying to tell us kind of how we're feeling. And also knowing when you might not be the right person to speak to a grieving carer. Whether you are a veterinary professional or a carer yourself, if you're grieving or struggling yourself, you need to have self-compassion for that. And if you can't give compassion to yourself at this time, you can't do this for another person. So actually, if you're going through a grief yourself, maybe you're not the person right this moment to speak to that carer or speak to that friend. But maybe you will be the right person in a couple of months. It's going to be different for different people. And finding support for yourself. So as carers going through grief, it's really important that you don't keep your emotions to yourself. It can be really, really hard, especially if we're feeling disenfranchised, to share how we're feeling with others. Maybe we can't talk at work about it openly. But I actually hear from carers often that they feel they can't even talk to their family members about it in the home. And often this is because actually, not that they're worried about being misunderstood, but maybe you're worried about upsetting a fellow family member, especially on a day that maybe you perceive that they're doing really well. But actually, I'm sure that if the opposite was happening, you would want your family to talk to you about it. So please do be open to each other. Grief is really different for everyone, and that can be within the family too. We might all be feeling and acting in certain ways. So please talk to your friends, your vet, or a trained professional such as a counsellor to ensure that you've got the time to process this in exactly the way that you want to. And if you're a veterinary professional, it's really important to get support yourself too, even if you're not grieving yourself, especially if you have any out of the ordinary deaths at work, any crashes or euthanasias that are just particularly difficult. Okay, so the top takeaways for this evening is the human animal bond is amazing, but our grief is just as large as the love that we hold for our pets. Grief isn't linear, and we don't have to subscribe to any one way of being in our grief. End of life care can be made slightly more comfortable with increased conversations and plans where possible. Memorializing our pets is a really lovely way to forge a new relationship with them in their death. And when we're supporting others, listen to hear, not to respond. Self-care and self-compassion is paramount in being able to provide support to others, and also allowing grief and joy to coexist. Just because you're having a good day or you've laughed with a friend or a family member, that doesn't mean that you miss your pet any less. And as you do move through the grief journey and you feel differently as time goes on, it doesn't mean that your pet means any less to you than they did at the beginning. Okay, so there's a couple of references here for anyone interested in the Habry research. That is the website to find it on, and some support resources for grievers here too. I've linked Counselling Directory or the BACP website for finding a suitably qualified therapist, but also the Blue Cross and Cats Protection have a free helpline for anyone struggling with pet loss. Thank you for joining.